Um, Good evening. My name is Anwar Majid. I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities. And this is the last of the lecture and seminar series of the fall 2010. And we could not have found a better speaker for this occasion than David Lenson. Um, I, I was lucky enough to spend a few hours with him before he came to the reception. And in the process, I discovered things that are not in his biography that you read about, that he is a very accomplished saxophone player. He performs about 100 gigs a year. That's a lot. That's many days. I mean, he goes, okay. In addition to that, he's very committed to worker rights, and for a number of years, 3 years, I think, he was the president of the union at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and at Boston as well, right? So that's another part of his interesting intellectual. On top of that, he's the author of the book that some of you have read, or many of you have read, on drugs, and he's a professor of comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And he's the former editor of the Massachusetts Review, which is a very prominent journal, which celebrated its 50th anniversary under his leadership. He was also co-host and producer of, is it MR Squared or Mr. Squared, MR Squared, the magazine's radio program. By night, a professional musician. He has played saxophone with Buddy Guy, Junior Wells, John Lee Hooker, and many other bands. He recently appeared in the 2009 PBS documentary, The Botany of the Desire, a tribute to the work of Michael Pollan, right? Well, we're delighted to have him with us tonight, and we thank him profusely for coming.
Well, as you see from the biography, I'm one of those people that gives comparative literature a bad name. It's known as a nest of dilettantes. And if ever there was anybody that illustrated that side of it, I'm afraid it's me. I was so excited to get this invitation. I must thank Anwar and Liz for making all this possible. I was so excited because the mission of the Center for Global Humanities, as expressed in this sentence, really intrigued me. And the sentence from the website is, by promoting the study of cultures and identities through the methods and theories of disciplines in the broadly defined field of the humanities, the center contributes new insights and into the human condition that are as critical to our well-being and the future of our societies as are the findings in various scientific and medical programs. And when Anwar invited me to come, I thought, what's the best thing I can do? It feels funny to be talking about a book that's 15 years old, but I'm offering it to you as an example of what can be done when the humanities intrude where they're not supposed to go. I said in the preface that I wrote the book solely because I was completely unqualified to do it. And that's true. I mean, I had no qualifications. Nothing in my educational background would really explain how I got interested in the subject. Part of it comes from political concerns about the large incarcerated population in the United States. Part of it comes from a sort of anarchist streak in me that doesn't like prohibitions, feels that prohibitions surrender the rights to regulate and educate effectively. And so I thought, well, you know, here's something that perhaps somewhere in there, there's room for another book. There's room for another book. So I wrote this thing, and I was warned by my colleagues immediately. This is professional suicide. You publish this thing, you'll be at UMass for the rest of your life. You'll never get another job offer. Nobody will ever take you seriously again. That argument cut two ways. One was that usual snobism of academics, that if more than 15 people read your book, it means you've sold out. We have some of that. And then, but the other side of it was that the subject was, at the time, very difficult to talk about. And I think I became aware of this because teaching things like 19th century French poetry, to use just one example, it's almost impossible to discuss Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire and Stéphane Mallarmé without bringing up the subject, since they bring it up themselves all the time. And so at this point in the 90s, it still felt transgressive to speak about drugs in the classroom. And yet I began to find it more and more unavoidable. And as that happened, I thought, well, I think there needs to be a freedom of discussion around this area, the kind of freedom that only the humanities could really provide. So I started pondering this and how to make it work. So in spite of my colleagues' advice, and I showed several of them the manuscript, I shipped it off. The first place I submitted it to was Minnesota. That they accepted it so fast it was blinding. And this is a time when people were having trouble getting academic books accepted. Bang, they took it right away. And they made it their lead title for the following fall, fall 95, and they booked me a book tour and everything, and lots of radio appearances and some TV. And it all just went off to a blazing start. All the reviews were good. The publicity was excellent. For 2 or 3 months, it just ran like blazes. And then suddenly, Minnesota realized they had printed too many copies. It was not going to be the smash hit that they thought it was. And so suddenly, they began to withdraw resources from it. And for example, and you can't make stuff like this up. My publicist resigned and went to work for Captain Kangaroo. I swear, as if to do penance for all the publicity he lavished on this book. So for a while, things were kind of quiet. Another cute story about the beginning of the book is how we got the blurb from Timothy Leary. The same publicist called him and said, "I'm going to send you a manuscript." And much to our amazement, Leary read it. So the publicist called back and said, "Well, will you give us a blurb?" And Leary goes, "Why don't you just write the blurb and I'll sign it?" So we had this insane conversation, me and the publicist, talking back and forth over the phone, trying to pretend we were Timothy Leary, which is impossible to pretend. So we made up some gobbledygook and sent it to Leary, and he said, "Never mind, I'll write it myself." And that's how it came to be. The topic was still so novel that at the ACA convention in Chicago, the APA convention in Chicago, where the title was displayed prominently, the University of Minnesota Press filled their booth with lava lamps, as if like the only way you could talk about this was to transpose yourself back to the 60s somehow. And it was very funny because I wound up doing a signing at that convention the next aisle over from Larry King. And the publicist who was present managed to force an exchange of books. So Larry King wound up with a signed copy, and somewhere I have a dusty copy of this book by Larry King. So the beginning of it was really a lot of fun. It was very exciting, and I did tons and tons of radio and just had a great time with it. Then things got quiet for a while. And the book has had like a cat has had many lives. It's died and come back to life repeatedly. Finally, a new director came on board at Minnesota Press, and they decided finally to paperback it. But they were too cheap to paperback it in any conventional way. So they went in and took the surplus copies from the 10,000 or whatever they printed, ripped the covers off of them, made a new cover. And that explains why, amazingly, one of the students here has the upside down copy, like they slipped on one. I've never seen that before, but that's the explanation. But then at the time of its reissue, it perked up again and started selling again a little bit. And then a wonderful thing happened when in 2001, Michael Pollan published this book, The Botany of Desire, which became a bestseller. It's a brilliant book about the human relationship with 4 plants. I think it's tulips, potatoes, apples, and marijuana. And in the marijuana section, Michael quoted extensively from this book. And then because The Botany of Desire was such a big success, there was a boomerang effect, and my book got going again. And then, suddenly, in the last 2 years, with Proposition 19 in California and with a lot of other referenda in a lot of states, suddenly the discussion is becoming more public again. And this again has accounted for the book rebounding at another time. So it's oddly alive even though it's 15 years old. And it's kind of amazing. It's still in print and it's still going. Now, the reason why I saw this opening at that time was that after the two Reagan terms, in the term of George H.W. Bush, the Clinton administration, while not changing any of their policies, eased up on the rhetoric. They stopped talking about drugs and making it a front page issue all the time. And that was good in a way, because before that we had come through the period of just say no, Nancy Reagan's crusade against drugs. The minute you see a drug, just say no, and it'll go away. Yet the problem did not go away. And I came to refer to that as a just say nothing period, because during that time it became very difficult to write about drugs. It became very difficult to publish articles or op-eds about drugs. It became difficult to talk about it in the classroom. And again, it was that pressure to integrate it with a fuller portrait of history that made me think about starting this project. And so it came about then in the Clinton era, when you could suddenly talk about it a little bit. And so I saw an opportunity, and there was certainly, God knows, there's plenty written on this subject, as I found out when I began researching. In the W.E.B. Du Bois Library at UMass, I swear there's about 15 miles of drug books, just more and more and more and more and more of them. And so that to begin researching, it was to be daunted. I mean, there were all kinds of different things. So the first thing I had to do was figure out what kinds of drug writing had already existed, and to try to figure out where that hole was that I wanted to slip in with an approach from the humanities. So I did this taxonomy of drug genres that's in the book, but it's worth actually reading it. There are 7 genres of drug writing. Taken in no special order, they are, first, the universe of clinical studies conducted by physicians, biologists, and psychologists who investigate the biochemical and behavioral effects of psychoactive substances on living organisms. In other words, it's the clinical literature. Second, pharmacology. Hi, Amy. Second, pharmacology, a specialized wing of biochemistry that records the physical composition of drugs and their impact on human and animal brains. Third, work by historians, social scientists, and legal scholars on the relationships of drugs to the body politic and the body of law, including histories of the use and prohibition of particular substances, studies of users as deviant subgroups. Fourth, literary and popular memoirs or confessional narratives by users, ex-users, and narcotics agents. It's from this that what I call the standard drug narrative appears. And if you watch, for example, MTV or something like that, or A&E documentaries about rock stars, you can see the standard drug narrative come out. Now, I was a young, promising guitar player, and I had this great success with my band. And at that very moment of success, I began snorting cocaine, and it all fell apart, and I lost everything. And then I went into recovery, and then they'll show them there, toothless and ancient with an acoustic guitar. I'm back with music again now, though, so it's all okay. But it's the stand, and you'll see it. There's millions of confessional books of all kinds by people that have used drugs, and that's a very boring narrative, and it's used over and over and over again. Fifth, works of drama, fiction, and poetry that depict drug use of various kinds. Of course, that's a province of the humanities too. Sixth, the so-called literature of recovery, practical and inspirational texts designed to aid the reader in giving up a drug or drugs. And seventh, writing located at the crossroads of anthropology, psychology, and mysticism, and containing metaphysical and religious speculations prompted by the effects of psychedelic drugs. And in fact, that literature is perhaps the most interesting. It's not precisely a literature of the humanities, despite the fact that the modern school of it was instituted by Aldous Huxley. we study in humanities classes. But Huxley was stepping out of his own persona as a fiction writer in order to write The Doors of Perception and then Heaven and Hell, which is where that begins. So in a lot of ways, the literature of psychedelic drugs is the most metaphysically interesting. It's exciting. It delves into history. It does things like tries to decide what drug was in use at the Delphic Oracle in ancient Greece, what the Eleusinian mysteries were taking, and questions like that have a kind of an interesting connection with classical studies and the study of the ancient world. So this was this professional suicide, in other words, far from ending my career, completely revitalized it, because people were ready to start talking about this in the mid-90s. They were ready to break the silence in a whole new way, and that was a great advantage. And I got to go give talks all over the place and meet all kinds of interesting people, and it was just a wonderful thing. The dean gave me a raise. She liked it. Only at UMass could that happen. UMass has a history of anti-prohibitionism of all kinds. And I couldn't get a raise out of the dean any other way, except by what appeared this counterintuitive maneuver. What was different about it? Why is the book still around? Well, I needed a point to get the humanities involved in the question, and I did it by reversing the field. Instead of taking a clinical perspective or a top-down perspective on it, I decided I would try to switch to the user's point of view. What do drugs do to different people under different circumstances in different times and different places? And by doing that, I opened up a complexity. I problematized the subject so much that it got very interesting for a little while. It really began to ramify in all kinds of different ways. So it was a little bit risky because once you begin with the user's point of view, somebody goes, what right do you have to that? Who are you? You're just a college professor. What could you possibly know about this? Or worse yet, you do know about this. You're discredited. The way, and I concealed it in the book, there was a sort of there's a pattern of academic polish on the surface of the book that prevented it from becoming confessional. I did not wish to write a confession. However, my career as a musician emerged as a kind of antidote to my academic career, in that I went back to playing music after not doing it in the 60s. Nobody wanted sax players in the 60s. It was all guitar bands, everything. And then in 1970, the Rolling Stones put Bobby Keys on Exile on Main Street, and we were all back in business again. So I went back to playing music right at my first year of teaching, which is the hardest time to do anything. The first year of any academic career is incredibly difficult because you're giving every course for the first time. And yet I did it anyway. And once I started doing that, I just couldn't stop. And I played all through the 70s, all through the 80s. I retired 5 times, but it never did any good. I was always back again shortly. And it provided a wonderful antidote to the 8 years I'd been coddled in an Ivy League institution up in an ivory tower, far from ordinary people and how they live. So music served to connect me with the real world in a way that certainly my proper education never did. But of course, and it culminated with what I call my second PhD, which was when Muddy Waters waved his arms over my band and said, "You are all my children." And I think of that as my second PhD. It was my PhD in life. But the music business was then and is now drenched in drugs and alcohol first and foremost, because alcohol is an indisseverable part of the economy of the music business. It just has to be there. But then all kinds of other drugs too. Every trend that comes and goes in drugs in the country is reflected in the population of musicians and their audiences. And so I got to observe all of this, and I pretended I was just, in retrospect, that it was just observation. But in fact, I was deep in it. Like many people that came of age in the 60s, I thought that drugs might provide an avenue to some kind of enlightenment and liberation. And it took me a long time to get rid of that idea. It took some hard lessons for me to get rid of it. So that's how I knew what I know. But that was one of the questions that made me nervous in those first months. I was like, how do you know about this stuff? And I would pretend, oh, I don't know. I just kept my eyes open, saw what was happening. So that was the beginning of, that's how I knew what I knew. And then I just shifted the point of view around. So I kind of split my mind in half, a drug user on this side and a college professor on the other side. And what could they collaborate to come up with in this matter? Now, methodology was a problem, and I knew it was a problem, because you would be tempted to say a psychoanalytic approach would be useful, for example, and yet in the standard canon of Freudian psychotherapy, we're told that in order for the patient to benefit from therapy, you have to give up the use of psychotropic substances. Only then can you figure out what your real problems are, and only then can you begin to address them. Meanwhile, the drugs and the alcohol and so forth are just masking all of that. So that meant that the literature coming out of psychoanalysis is very, very little. And there really wasn't much to go on. It's like the method shut itself off before it even started. But adjacent to the field of psychology in the kingdom of philosophy is a province called phenomenology, or the study of mind and consciousness. Phenomenology had a run of popularity after the Second World War, when the impact of the work of Heidegger began to be felt, but also others too, Husserl, for example. And it translated into a bunch of really innovative literary critics like Hillis Miller and Maurice Blanchot, for example, really interesting, innovative critics that began to treat literature as an exercise in consciousness above all else. For so it is. I mean, whenever we consume an artwork, it's like putting a cartridge into ourselves so that we experience something else instead of what our mind would ordinarily have been doing at that moment. So it was, phenomenology seemed somehow appropriate, and yet I did not want to use the jargon, especially the Heideggerian jargon. This book has a sister book that came out at almost exactly the same time by the literary critic Avital Ronell, who was then at Berkeley and is now at NYU, I think, called Crack Wars. And so I eagerly got my copy of Crack Wars and found it was just a walk in some Heideggerian jungle of jargon and rhetoric. And I was left with the feeling at the end that this woman can't possibly have smoked crack. She just can't. She smoked too much Heidegger, is what she did. And luckily, I saw that coming. Her book is good, and I don't mean to denigrate it. It's good within the narrowness of that conscription. However, luckily, I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to stay away from jargon of almost any kind. So I just sort of set about writing the best English that I could. And I set about trying to take, wherever possible, the drug user's point of view, which meant not only trying to understand what drugs do to people in different circumstances, but also what the prohibitions and the laws and all those things do to people. And then the next stage, what does prohibition do to the effects of the drugs themselves? I have a secret theory that when marijuana is legalized, it's going to stop working. The only thing that makes it potent is its illegality. So, this is I figured out somehow the way to do this, and I was still fretting about methodology when I had lunch with my friend Sut Jolly, a great student of advertising history, and through the Media Education Foundation, the producer of many progressive films. And finally, at the end of lunch, he goes, "The hell with methodology, just write it." So by that time, I'd gotten to the point where I could pretend that I had a modus operandi. And sometimes the chapters operate a little differently. Sometimes I have to approach things in different ways. But it had a second underlying theme that united all of that, which the book is a sort of a tirade against consumerism. Another book that came out at about the same time was Listening to Prozac, which was a big bestseller, Peter Kramer's book that came out in 1993. And the question that I was left with after reading that is, If we are the most prosperous and successful nation in history, and remember these years, 1993, 95, were years of peace and prosperity. We were doing very well in all regards. The country was prospering. Why are we all so miserable if that's the case? And why is it that suddenly, the minute Prozac was introduced, I mean, it just began selling like hotcakes. It was amazing. And Kramer's book, of course, helped to fan those flames a bit, but it still didn't answer that question. Why is everyone so miserable? And what I decided was that a second layer of this text would be a kind of a polemic against consumerism, because consumerism is a metaphysic of desire. It's all about wanting things. It's never about stopping to appreciate the things that you have. It's always about wanting more. Now, we all have, for example, a list of the next 10 things we want to buy. And we may not write it down, but it's in our heads. The minute I have some money, I'm going to buy. And the minute you go buy the thing on top of the list, you enjoy it for a couple of days, then you forget about it, and number 2 comes up to number 1. So that we're in this condition of always needing something else, always wanting something else that's that we don't have yet. And this condition, a condition of constantly unsatisfied desire, as William Blake noted so long ago, can cause the erosion of all happiness and all character. And yet, we live in this world where this desire is promoted constantly. I then began to think of some kinds of drug use as dissent against consumerism. I started thinking about LSD that way. If you're tripping, you don't need to go buy anything. Just pick a stone up off the ground and look at it and see that underneath its porous surface lies a world of miracles. And you don't need to buy anything to do it. You don't need to buy special gear to wear. You don't need to go any place special to do it. You don't need to drive all day. It's just there. And so I thought, okay, if that's dissent, maybe marijuana is dissent in some way too. Now, that's a harder argument to follow because many people get stoned and go shopping, obviously. Lots of people do. And there is about it, especially in the manifestation of the marijuana high called the munchies, there's a great deal of desire, but it's desire that's satiable, that can be satisfied. And there is a contemplative side to the marijuana high that enables us to just look at things and find them funny in some way, find every object a kind of hilarious miracle of relocation. And that attitude, I think, expresses some dissent against this world of desire and desire and desire. When I wrote about the stimulants in the book, I decided that they were a savage parody of consumerism. That is, it's all about desire. If you're using cocaine, the only thing you're interested in is having some more cocaine. And if you get into freebasing or crack smoking, the pace speeds up furiously. It's like desire, 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 and you're furiously trying to satisfy it to the point where the whole machine just burns out. So I took these two sides of the question, and one side it was going to be a dissent against consumerism, and on the other side a savage parody of it. And I tried to work with those two things as bookends as I considered the different drugs. What I also had to do was to begin to interrogate the whole notion of sobriety. There's a little piece in here called The Very Short History of Sobriety, in which it became clear to me that the term is almost meaningless. That is, a sober mind would first of all have to be bifurcated into the various sobrieties. A person who is sniffing cocaine may still be sober as far as alcohol is concerned. A person who's smoking marijuana may be sober as far as ecstasy is concerned. So you have to sit there and go, well, sobriety already then means freedom from million substances. So the thing just shattered like a broken glass at that point. But also, there's a sense in which sobriety is a condition as a negative condition, can be sort of like freedom, for example. If I'm free, what am I going to do with that freedom? Well, it gives me the liberty to choose to do any number of things, but then the minute I do it, I'm not free anymore. Money's like that. A big pile of money is meaningless as just a big heap. but it becomes meaningful only when you spend it. So you have to get rid of it in order to realize it. And in some ways, sobriety is a concept similar to that. There's nothing that the sober mind can't think. A mind without the influence of any drug can think about any subject, can think heretically, can think sympathetically, can think compassionately, can think with hatred and prejudice and fear. There's no, when somebody says he's sober, I mean, maybe we think, oh, that means that person is serious. But we don't really know what's going on in the mind of a sober person. So the concept, again, taken from that point of view, just empties itself out. First, it shattered into a million pieces, and then it emptied itself out. And from that, I realized the ramifications of this whole question are so enormous as to be dizzying. For example, you must realize that if you take the user's point of view, there are really no two drug experiences that are the same. Every person is different from every other person. Every moment in their lives is different from every other moment in their lives, and the set and the setting, as the standard established by Timothy Leary goes, would never be repeatable. You know, we live in this river of constant change, so you can't repeat the experience. No two people will have the same experience. And then there's all these different drugs. So suddenly I'm thinking, it's like the Garden of Forking Paths in Borges' story. Suddenly, I just see this vast landscape of possibilities, things to think about. And that's when I realized that you can't generalize about this subject very much. The war on drugs, or as articulated by Richard Nixon originally in 1972 during the election campaign, was just a war on generalized drugs. Drugs, like this was one category of things that we could actually know about. But you notice, even while the war on drugs was raging and the Just Say No period was going on, you could drive past a mall on your way home and there'd be a 15-foot sign that said, drugs! You know, well, what's the story here? And then you quickly realize, and when you get in this problematizing mind, you find lots of problems. The problem was that the undifferentiated concept was making it impossible to talk about the subject. So there needed to be a re-examination of this. And believe it or not, it's very difficult to know what's a drug and what's not a drug. The boundary between drugs and spices, or between drugs and foods, is historically very difficult to draw. For example, what is salt? Is it food, spice, a drug? I don't know. That's a tough one. You know, what is sugar exactly? That's more of a food, but sugar is, to my mind, the gateway drug. It's the original drug that gets most everybody started in the life of addiction. How can I tell that? You just go down to the convenience store 10 minutes after the junior high school lets out and see what happens. It's like being trapped in a crack house. It's horrible. They tear each other apart trying to get to the last bag of this, that, or the other thing. So, you know, there's arguments for sugar then being a drug as well as a foodstuff. I almost wrote a book on that, but I realized that the history of sugar is so complicated and enormous, and in a lot of ways parallels the history of cocaine, in that it completely changed the economy of the Caribbean and led to an awful lot of slaves being imported from Africa to work in sugar plantations. It's such a vastly complicated thing, but yet it's like another white powder that popped up in the 70s and became big business. It was a similar situation in a lot of ways. Anyway, I never did write that book. But you see the difficulties. What's a drug and what's not a drug? It's not really that easy to say. And obviously, there's an implicit taxonomy buried in the fact that we can have these huge signs that say drugs at the same time that we're just supposed to say no. And none of us drives by the mall and rolls down the window and yells, no! You know, so why not? Well, clearly, then, that's the first beginning of taxonomies. You know, what's legal and what's not legal. But actually, it's much more complicated than that, as you might expect. The whole question of taxonomy is just murderously difficult. because we have pharmacological taxonomies, you know, all those diagrams with the C's and the O's and the H's, the things that sound like giant pigeons cooing. Those diagrams are descriptive in one sense and can be very precise in making taxonomies. But there are also basic legal taxonomies. For example, some drugs are legal, over-the-counter medications and that kind of thing. Then some are restricted by the prescription system, and some are just simply illegal. And that's the beginning right there of the taxonomy. A lot of the legal activity around drugs in the 20th century had to do with readjusting where certain substances fall in that taxonomy. No drug was illegal in America or Western Europe, believe it or not, until 1906. Prohibition is totally an invention of the 20th century. It's amazing. And each prohibition happened separately. This is not something like Nancy Reagan that just came down with one all-pronouncing negative syllable. It happened bit by bit. And every bit of the prohibition had something to do with an ulterior motive, usually involving suspicion of minorities or dissidents. For example, the first drug to be prohibited in America was opium. Why? Because the railroad owners felt that the Chinese workers that were working in the Northwest were not working at maximum efficiency, because when they got done at the end of the day, they went to opium dens and smoked opium instead of going to bars and drinking. So the pressure then came from the railroad owners on Congress to do something about it, and they did. The alcohol prohibition, it's the same thing. Why did Prohibition come about at the same time as World War I? It's because the breweries were owned and had always been owned in the United States by German Americans, and we were at war with Germany. So it's impossible to disassociate that prohibition from, there are many other factors, of course, went into it, but that was one of them. That was definitely one of them. The marijuana prohibition in the 30s came because farmers in the Southwest, in Southern California, New Mexico, and Arizona, were employing, as they employ today, migrant labor from Mexico, most of whom smoked pot. And they wanted a mode of crowd control, a way that they could stop and arrest anybody at any time that they wanted to. And it's funny because Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the ancestor agency of the DEA, didn't want to be bothered with this problem. He had to be convinced by constant lobbying and constant pressure to make that substance illegal. But it all has to do with fear of immigrants and fear of the Hispanic population. Similarly, cocaine, when that was interdicted because narratives were fabricated showing that black men who snorted cocaine just wanted nothing more than to rape white women. And that's why that had to be declared illegal. The last example is from the 1960s, when LSD in October of 1966 was declared illegal, and when Sandoz Laboratories agreed to stop making it. This was simply a measure against dissent, because there were all these hippies out there furiously dropping acid, and there was actual serious talk by people like Timothy Leary about turning the LSD use into a kind of a spiritual revolution that would be international. There was a schism in the acid community early on between the elitists like Huxley, who said, only we should take it. Only we educated, well-mannered white men should actually take this thing, and then we'll tell everybody else about it. And then when Leary started, he was that way about it too, but he was converted to the mass consumption model by people like Ken Kesey, for example. And he at one point actually was endeavoring to set up a factory in Mexico that would manufacture the world's supply of LSD. Unfortunately, he was shut down before that could happen. But each one of those prohibitions then comes for an ulterior motive. There's another reason why these substances were outlawed at the times when they were outlawed. So this fouls the taxonomy still more, because each one of these is a separate thing. And then, every state has a whole bunch of different laws. federal law followed upon the establishment of state laws. Similarly, when alcohol prohibition ended, it ended because the foundation fell out of it. The states began to withdraw from the prohibition. New York State, by the way, much to its credit, withdrew the first day. They said, sorry, we're not going to enforce this. And you know what? They sent federal officers in to control for alcohol use on the streets. Federal police were in charge of enforcing prohibition in New York State. And it's funny because nowadays, if Proposition 19 had just passed in California, somehow I don't think sending in federal police to patrol it is going to work. It's just too big a problem. And look what happened. You see these old movies about New York in the days of Prohibition. It's always the feds everybody's worried about, not the cops. It's the feds. That's because there was that direct kind of enforcement. So the way the marijuana prohibition is ending, indeed, is like a historical repetition of the end of alcohol prohibition. The states are falling out. The federal government has not budged. They have a categorical position. Eric Hodder, the Attorney General, had to plead with the population of California to defeat it, not because he really cares about marijuana use, but because it would have precipitated a confrontation between states' rights and the federal authority that would have been almost unprecedented in our history. And so I'm sure they were greatly relieved. Obama does not need that kind of a confrontation. It's a pointless one. It will fan the fires of states' rights activists at a time when he's trying to make a case for what the federal government can really do. So again, this foils taxonomy in a lot of ways. Every state has a different taxonomy of how drugs are to be classified. The federal taxonomy is kind of an interesting one. It's a measure of utility versus poisonousness in some way. Insofar as a drug has a medical purpose, then an excuse can be made for making it prescribable. Insofar as a drug has no demonstrated medical purpose, then you can outlaw it completely. And insofar as a drug has a few poisonous side effects, you can then make it freely available to everyone. So that's the basic structure of the federal prohibitions and regulations. So this is at odds with pretty much every state one. It's at odds with the popular taxonomies. People talk about the uppers and the downers. That's a taxonomy. It's not a sophisticated taxonomy, but it's a taxonomy nevertheless. And people think, drug users think about drugs in different categories than the federal government or than the state governments do. So the problem here is that you just keep trying to determine what kind of a taxonomy has any use, and it's not easy to discover. A lot of the taxonomy is also driven by marketing, and one of the really interesting, I'm surprised at this. It was a sort of a chancy thing to say at the time, but I predicted in this book that there would be a coming war between the large pharmaceutical companies and street manufacturers and dealers because they were trying for the same business. In the 60s, SmithKline and French was selling a lot of stimulants, dexedrines and dexamyls and stuff like that. And they were used the way people use Ritalin and Adderall today, just as stimulants for either for work purposes or for recreational purposes. And so when suddenly the federal government curtailed the use of amphetamines by making them harder to get prescribed. It used to be a cinch to get them prescribed. Everybody knew what symptoms you were supposed to recite at the infirmary when you went down, and you recited them and you got your prescription. Now it's like it is today, in other words, with Adderall and Ritalin. But the SmithKline and French bitterly resented that because just shortly after that, cocaine came on the market in unprecedented quantities in the country. Cocaine is a stimulant, not all that dissimilar from amphetamines. Most of the stimulants are similar chemically. So all this business is these huge cartels, these enormous fortunes, money too voluminous to be housed anywhere. It was just something the pharmaceutical companies envied. And so their support for the prohibition became contingent upon their own ability to wage a parallel marketing campaign. And right now, that's a lot of profit to lose, the stimulant market, an awful lot. And they've had to work their way back into it again by dreaming up new ways to prescribe Ritalin and Adderall as the ADHD remedies that they're sold as now. But they were marketed mostly as diet drugs in the 50s and 60s, which is ridiculous because they don't work as diet drugs. The minute you stop using them, you just put the weight right back on. So then the other battle, and you can see this battle reflected today in a lot of ways. There's a big push against methamphetamine at the moment. It's not as much of a problem in New England as it is in the Middle West, but it's still enough of a problem that they're worried about it. They're worried about it because it competes for the Adderall and Ritalin market. And just when they'd gotten their feet really on the ground again for selling stimulants, here comes another street stimulant. So that battle is still playing itself out. And certainly it has a lot to do with the violence in the Southwest today. And this is still that same battle playing itself out. When you prohibit, you can't stop the use of a drug by prohibiting it. So what happens is, people find a way to fight the prohibition, and one of those ways is to form organized crime networks, as Al Capone did during alcohol prohibition, and that's just what's going on in the Southwest. You have these enormous, powerful, heavily funded gangs that would cease to exist tomorrow if the substance became legal. So it's a thought. Now, there's other examples too. Heroin use is declining somewhat. Why? Because it's so easy to get Percocets. Once again, the manufacturers of OxyContin, Percocets, and so forth have moved into that marketing competition with heroin and are making headway. This has really happened. Prozac and ecstasy are not that dissimilar. In a lot of ways, the difference between them is the difference of marketing. One is marketed through the prescription system. The other is marketed through, raves and counterculture. So this battle is still going on, but this makes what kind of a drug is what kind of a drug even more difficult, even more baffling to figure out. So, and they want the marijuana market as well. There's all these pills like cannabinols and marinols that are meant to capture the salutary effects of THC on various kinds of wasting diseases like AIDS or for people undergoing chemotherapy. They want you to take the pill instead. Well, what actually happens is the patients don't like the pill because many of them don't like to get high. You take one pill too many and you're gaga. But you can regulate your own consumption much better if you just smoke it. So the medical marijuana issue is figured in here. The medical marijuana issue had barely begun at the time when this book was written. And one of the interesting effects, of course, at the time it was said, it's a Trojan horse stuffed with legalizers. And you know what? That's absolutely what it was. A lot of the headway that's come has been forcing discussion of the subject during the period when it was an interdicted, unspeakable thing, forcing discussion of the subject by bringing up this very basic humanitarian issue. Don't we all have the right to the best and most efficacious cure that we can find for whatever ails us? And here's a cheap, convenient cure that's right under our eyes, and we can't use it. So it's not that this problem is resolved now, but it's getting resolved a little bit. And sure enough, the present drift towards ending the marijuana prohibition comes in the main because it aroused people's sympathy first, and then it aroused their curiosity. Like, well, how bad is this stuff? 45 million Americans have smoked marijuana, but that's still, there's still like 4/5 of the population that hasn't. So what did they know about this? It forced them to think about it, and that was the principal aim of it all. So bit by bit, it became easier to talk about the subject. And I even, at first, I felt really funny about doing it in the classroom. It felt transgressive. It seemed like you shouldn't talk about this stuff. And later on, when my friends at other universities tried it, they felt the same thing, like a silence would fall. And it's totally ridiculous silence that fell, because here's somebody up there that wants to discuss the subject, a room full of people who've almost all used some kind of a drug or other, and yet we have to pretend that the silence falls. We have to pretend that we can't talk about it. We have to pretend that none of you are drug users, and I don't know anything about it. And fortunately, when that ended, it suddenly became possible to talk about it in class. And nowadays, it's pretty easy. I don't know about your classes, but nowadays, I just raise it as an issue because it's more on the public mind. It has a lot more intellectual concern now than it did at this time. So the aim was basically always to open up discussion. At the end of the book, I pitched this plea for words. I want people to throw more words at the subject. And by God, if there's one respect that the book has succeeded, it's just that. There are now so many drug books published. At the time, mine was a complete novelty, mine and Avital Ronell's. Now, the Boston Phoenix has a top 10 drug books of the year list on New Year's. It's amazing. Not just Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan did a lot to break the ice in the Botany of Desire, but all kinds of other wonderful things happened. And there's eventually the subject moved back into aesthetics and literary history with Marcus Boone's book, The Aesthetics of Excess, in 2004. A book for which I was a reader for Harvard University Press. That's the other perk of having written a book like this, is every press wants you to be a reader. So you get to read a whole lot of new drug books as they come up. And then now some amazing books are being published that could not have been published at the time this one was. I'm thinking particularly of an amazing book on addiction that I read this summer by a physician from Vancouver named Gabor Mate. The book is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Now, there's been a lot of writing about addiction before this book, and I read it all. And I had my own little theory of addiction as the regridding of the space-time coordinates and blah, blah, blah. But this book is incredible. This man runs a street clinic in Vancouver that deals only with the most hardcore addicts of all kinds. And it's an amazing, humane book that I think gets closer to the real core of the question than anything I've ever seen before. And this was published just last year, I think 2009. So it worked, by sort of breaking the ice and calling for all these words to be thrown at the subject. There's now more activity and more thought about it than ever before, and not just in books, but in magazine articles. The journalists feel free to explore it now. And there, it just wasn't true 15 years ago. The unspeakable has become speakable. And you want to talk about the humanities. If you can insert the humanities into a problem that appears intractable, into a problem that feels fraught with division and conflict, or a problem that people don't dare speak about, it's amazing how humanizing the discourse, just that little bit, can have the effect of changing the whole field, and then, of changing the world. And we're now standing on the verge of an amazing revolution as marijuana prohibition comes to an end. Yes, Proposition 19 failed in California, but in Massachusetts, we put a non-binding up and down referendum, legalize or don't legalize, on the ballot in 69 cities and towns in the state. Guess how many it passed in? 69 out of 69, by margins like 62-38 and stuff like that. So we were those of us that have been active in this field for a long time were disappointed that Proposition 19 didn't pass. We cackled and said to ourselves, well, in Massachusetts, we'll be first instead. The hell with California. And these are changes I did not think were possible. I never thought I would live to see the day when people could have an intelligent conversation about the merits of prohibition. And if there's one little wish I had for this book when I sent it off, it's like sending a child to college or releasing a dove into the air. When I sent it off, that was my one wish for it. Let the let the discourse change the world. Let people think for a change instead of just reacting and closing their minds. And you know, this is why it's so exciting to be here at the center, because that's the aim of the center, is get people to find approaches to very difficult and intractable problems that are only available through the humanities because of the flexibility. We're process thinkers, most of us. You know, if you take college courses, that some courses you just expected to download a body of information. And so you download it, and then you upload it on the final, and you're done. But we, you know, there's a kind of a product there. You learn this, learn this, learn this. But in the humanities, we're teachers of process thinking. We want to just get up there and think in front of you. We want you to think in front of us. We want to all somehow find a way to think together, not to reach, you know, a conclusion necessarily, but just for the illumination of discussing and thinking about these things. And this is a great mission for a Center for the Humanities to have, and I'm so honored to have been invited here to be part of it. What happens now? Q&A. Okay. Oh, okay. Wonderful. Wow, this is like Oprah. I don't know. Maybe you'll find a new car in your parking space.
Oh.
Questions, complaints?
If everybody could just speak into the microphone when you talk, please.
Is this going to work? Hi. Thank you for that enlightening talk. I can't help but thinking about the Puritan basis of our society right
Yes.
now. And I'm intrigued by the concept that you espoused about there really being an underlying financial consideration, which starts to make a lot more sense to me than the lobbying effort of the Puritan sort of anti-hedonistic kind of attitude. But I can't help but also think if we legalized all drugs, the revenue generated just by taxation and regulation alone would be absolutely outstanding and save a whole lot of money on law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that propelled Prop 19 in California into a position to pass, even though it didn't. The financial arguments were compelling. Here's Schwarzenegger trying to deal with this enormous budget deficit. Where are you going to find a new revenue flow at this time in history? I mean, Massachusetts is rather stupidly trying to find it by building casinos when we already have too many casinos in Connecticut. That may not work. It may not work. But tax and regulate, and you know, we have a bill too in Massachusetts, tax and regulate bill similar to the one in California. It'll be on the ballot in 2 years, and the financial side of it is enormous. Plus, the cost of incarceration is so great. It costs much more money to keep a person in prison for a year than to send them to college for a year. And there's a lot of contravening pressures. In California, it's the prison guards union that wants more prisons, more inmates, more incarceration, because that's where their livelihood lies. But at the last minute, a weird thing happened in California that may have helped to defeat Prop 19. As you may know, there's an enormous industrial marijuana plant going up in the city of Oakland right now, such that that neighborhood in Oakland has been renamed Oaksterdam. And this is actually Clinton remarked on Oaksterdam yesterday and told them they better watch out. I mean, Obama didn't. They better be careful. And if you want to, there's now it's to the point where ancillary institutions are forming around this. One of which is Oaksterdam University. I swear. Go to the website. It's like every other college website. It's got smiling, happy college students on the front. But there's this little thing, go to college with people just like you, stoners, in other words. So with this huge, it's largely the work of one man. I can't remember his name. But while this Oaksterdam project is building up, a lot of the family farm growers, which is what the Humboldt County illegal growers were, the ones that are now supplying legally the dispensaries in California, got panicky. They go, my God, it's going to be just like what industrial farming did to the family farm. It's going to do to us. And so they began to lobby against Prop 19. They did. I couldn't believe it. It was astounding. That was sort of a windy answer to that question, wasn't it? That's what college professors get paid to do, make mountains out of molehills.
So would you be in favor of legalizing all drugs?
Yes, because by prohibition, you lose the right to regulate. And the right to regulate may be important. Right now, if something's illegal, anything goes. Just as, say, during alcohol prohibition, bathtub gin and all kinds of poisonous crap was sold. People died from the impurities in it and so forth and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's likely. But to get back to one other point, yes, other drugs are more dangerous and would have to be regulated differently than marijuana. Marijuana could potentially be regulated on the model of alcohol. Cocaine, which is supposed to be terrifically dangerous, causes 2,000 deaths a year in the United States. Aspirin causes 2,000 deaths a year in the United States. The problem with the war on drugs is the marijuana thing is such a big piece of it that heroin and coke and that stuff are just tiny. And if the marijuana prohibition goes, there wouldn't be any excuse for having an enormous agency like the DEA around anymore. I mean, they could certainly downsize it.
Why haven't the pharmaceutical industries been further behind legalizing some of these drugs?
Why
haven't the pharmaceuticals lobbied more to take back, to legalize the drugs so they would have more business?
Well, it depends, again, it depends on which drugs. I mean, some of them they don't want legalized because, say, methamphetamine, they're competing with it, so they don't want it legalized.
But wouldn't they then be able to manufacture it?
Probably, but they do anyway. There's this product called Dazoxin, which is just clinical meth. And so you can, if you can get a prescription to it, you could buy clean meth, but they haven't been able to market it very well. Adderall and Ritalin are the real winners, and both of those are simply amphetamines. So, Ritalin is made from one amphetamine salt, and Adderall from two. But yeah, I mean they've been a little bit all over the map. I mean, for a long time, the alcohol distributors and manufacturers lobbied against repealing the marijuana prohibition because they thought this would cut into their business. I think, as what Amy said a minute ago, it's like it never hurts to follow the money with these questions, and that's what they're doing. They're forming their positions based on economy, and really it's always a good idea. Maybe it's just the old Marxist in me, that you have to look at the economics of every situation. I think it's worth it. This is great, 2 microphones.
Thanks for coming today. I really liked your book and really liked your talk, and your argument is unique and compelling and valid. But my question is, as I was reading the book, I saw there was a recurring motif of a permanent war economy that the United States seems to be attempting to carry out. And do you think the reason that medical marijuana has been legalized in so many states recently is because we're transitioning our focus from the war on drugs to the war on terror?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I did argue in here that for a while, after the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we needed a new enemy. And we always seem to need an enemy. And for a while, it was the war on drugs was ramped up. Then they tried a new concept, narco-terrorism, because and there is oftentimes a relationship between terrorist organizations and the drug economy, as we see in many places in the world today. So it was. I tried to argue that the drug user became the new communist, because you can't tell a communist by looking at one. It could be anybody. It could be the worker in the next cubicle. It could be your mom. It could be yourself. So you have to be on constant vigilant guard against commies because you can't tell them by sight. And similarly with drug use, it could be anybody. It could be my mother. It could be my cousin. It could be me. And they blend in that way. It always helps to have enemies that blend in. That didn't work out so well, so now we have enemies that are portrayed as looking totally different than the way we look, so that we can visualize their enmity. And Reagan tried it. He announced that Libyans had entered the country, this is like 81 or 82, to assassinate him, even though the story had no basis in fact. But that was an attempt to say, look, they're coming to get us. And then eventually in 2001, they did come to get us, but it was premature. So yes, we have now a different set of enemies.
Hi. You're probably aware that there was a study done that looked at the placebo versus antidepressants and actually found that the placebo was as effective as antidepressants in sort of your run-of-the-mill depression, not people who are severely depressed. Mm-hmm. And some other studies have looked at the marketing of things like creating social phobia, so that we can then sell a drug for social phobia. It looks like what we're seeing is more and more and more drug use of any kind right now. We're at a tough point, I think, as humans in this kind of rough world that we live in. Mm. I'm wondering if you have any vision that over time we might see, as humans are more aware of things, for example, the placebo being as effective as the antidepressant, that we might over time see humans using less drugs.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it shows that it proves that the effects of drugs are not purely chemical, they're also cultural. A placebo's got none of the chemistry, but all of the culture. So, these things it's not simple. There's clearly a sense in which you can do a chemical analysis of a drug, but how it's marketed, who uses it, where and when is the rest of the story. One thing I'm really proud of is that over the years, I've managed through every kind of antidepressant, I've managed to stay depressed. So I'm completely proud of that.
I know in Amsterdam, someone came back from there and told me that they, I guess that they're very open about it. I guess you can buy it in the corner drugstore or something like that. And I'm not really aware how it works or anything, but I'm sure the state has some regulations of it. Mm-hmm. And my question is, number one, I don't know how long they've done that, and has it, when they did go to that, was there a spike in crime or a lessening of it? And number two, if you went in there, and I guess, I don't know, can you buy any drug imaginable? Do they have a list of this would be good for, they say depression, and this would be good for something else or something like that?
Well, first of all, cannabis drugs are not legal in the Netherlands. They actually aren't. What they have is a sort of a policy of ignoring it. And this was a very enlightened decision that was made by the Dutch after World War II. They determined that what gets young people using the harder, more difficult drugs is that they go to buy hashish or marijuana and meet guys that are selling, since you have to meet somebody in an alley during Prohibition, you may find that the person you're meeting has a diversified product line. So the Dutch decided that they would completely separate the market for heroin and cocaine and amphetamines from the marijuana market by just bringing the marijuana market up onto the surface. This has been true for a long time. Right now, there's a sort of a backlash going on in the Netherlands against that policy because, we talk about narco. They're experiencing narco tourism. Like people go travel there for the sole purpose of sitting in a cafe and getting high, and they're beginning to. A lot of the population is beginning not to like the narco tourists. So there's been some talk about banning foreigners from the coffee shops where marijuana is sold. Like that would work. like that would work. But the Dutch policy it's a funny one because it seems very enlightened, and yet they didn't change the law in order to affect it. And it has worked to a greater or lesser extent. You know, if you can buy marijuana from a corner store, back in the 70s in Amsterdam, you could buy it from the lounge at the Paradiso Theater. So you could go to see a punk rock show, and there'd be a vendor behind the counter with all different kinds of hashish. That's how it started, and it spread to the cafes from a few select locations here and there around the city. And it has worked. It has worked. They have some heroin problem there, but no more so than every other European country. Nice. I'll come back and check it out. You think it'll be 20 years in Maine? Mm-hmm. No, I'm pretty confident. It's got 2 years to run in Massachusetts. And I'm not usually confident about these things at all, but this time I am.
Hi, thank you for coming. You mentioned the drug companies trying to break into the illegal drug market different ways for different substances. Can you comment on the drug cartels now trying to break into the prescription medication market with counterfeits, and how that's becoming a real problem for people that don't make a choice to take a recreational drug? And if you're aware, if there are any, there's any war directed along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of struggle over these markets, and I'm observing that the drug companies are doing better today in penetrating the market for street drugs than they were doing 15 years ago, and that's an interesting thing. I mean, in some ways it's not altogether a bad thing, because at least the standards of purity are there. You can pretty much count on a Percocet to be Percocet, where a bag of heroin could be anything. So they have that advantage. But of course, in order for them to exploit that, they have to defeat the regulatory mechanism by which they're living. That is, they have to prescribe all these drugs legitimately and then get them to the street. And somehow it's working. It's working because they're overprescribed, and because a lot of patients would rather just sell them off than take them. So that's what accounts for the Massachusetts Daily Collegian, the student newspaper at UMass, just ran a series of articles last week on the availability of stimulants on campus. It's incredible. They're just everywhere. Anytime you need one, you can just go get it. But in order for them to get that kind of penetration of that market, they have to defeat the regulatory mechanism that's been feeding them all these years.
I'm talking about them marketing or trying to market substances that they know they're not
right.
Not
that's the pushback.
Work. Like,
that's
I
the
found
pushback.
some information. They said that half the drugs that you would buy online, if the place doesn't have a physical address, they would be counterfeit.
Yes. Yeah, I tried it actually once, just out of curiosity. I tried to get some Ritalin online. It was just absolutely nothing. It was like no dose. I mean, really, I think that's what it was. So no, I would definitely advise against that. I mean, if you buy drugs over the internet, you're just a fool. And I admit I was at one time.
First, thanks for coming. My question is about, so you see a lot of effort towards anti-prohibition of drugs with, the legalization of medical marijuana, but something I've noticed particularly in the audience towards younger people who are underage, is still this push of campaigns for fear for things like above the influence and, celebrities who are commonly known to use and practice using recreational drugs, but yet speak out against the use of them to young people. Right. Do you see the only example I can really think of is the Drug Policy Alliance, but do you see any sort of step back against those organizations that sort of instill fear in young people about drug education?
I think those attempts to scare people off drugs. Remember that poster from the 80s? This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain with a side of pork sausage. I mean, that fear tactic didn't really work. And it had the effect of, with the DARE program in the schools, for example, it had the effect of shutting down honest discussion. Because once you just simply say no, or this stuff will kill you, there's nothing left to be said. And so consequently, young people long ago stopped looking to their elders for advice about how to deal with this strange component of human character. Only the Inuits, before the arrival of the white men, were a culture with no drugs. Why? Because you look at the glacial landscape, there's just nothing out there to smoke, shoot, or eat. There's nothing but ice in all directions. So the Inuits were the only, according to anthropologists, the only culture ever recorded that did not have some kind of relationship with psychotropic substances. And so that means it's an inevitable part of human life. And the extent that we don't talk about it has some of the same stultifying effect of 100 years ago, people not wanting to talk about sex. Nobody, when I was growing up, nobody would tell me about sex. At some point, my mother slipped me a book, a sort of clinical narrative, and I was disgusted. I said, I'm never going to do that. And similarly, the shutdown of discussion that's involved in those fear tactics is great. Now, it's not to say they may not be effective occasionally. There's a part of the ad campaign against Prop 19 was a poster showing a school bus that's been rammed into by a car from the side. And down below it says nothing but defeat Prop 19. As if the school buses are going to be open targets.
Having looked at this to the extent you have, what arguments would you buy or agree with that would say there are short-term and long-term risks to a legalized environment? I mean, what would society have as an impact if all of a sudden, things became legalized?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is hard not to look at alcohol, which is by far the most toxic and damaging drug on the market, and it's legal. Alcohol will destroy you down to the cellular level. Your cells are going to start to come apart if you use it long enough. And I'm speaking as an alcoholic. I know that this is true. You can feel it deteriorating. As AA says, it's a spiritual, mental, and physical disease all at once. It has many different ways to destroy you. As one person said, it can remove a spot from your shirt, then it can remove your marriage, then it can remove your job, then it can remove your house. It's the great remover. And yet it's legal. It's regulated to be sure, but it's legal. Now, you have to conclude, you have to think about that. What is the risk of legalizing heroin, which is by comparison not nearly as toxic? What's the risk that we're not already running? We're used to living in a society with this most dangerous drug. I mean, alcohol causes, not causes, but is involved in a lot of domestic violence. It's been a lot of traffic fatalities and a lot of lives cut short or lives made less productive. So if we can live with that risk, and somehow I think we are still living, we can live with the other risks too.
Well, then taking alcohol as an analogy, what would you expect to be the social, spiritual, and physical consequences of legalizing marijuana? I think that was the question. Actually,
I don't think they're going to be that great because everybody that wants to buy marijuana can already do it. If you want it, you can get it. I don't buy the argument that more users will pop out of the ground. That was not the experience in the Netherlands, it turns out. The number of users of hashish did not rise when they decriminalized it. And I'm not sure that we'd see much effect. The first effect would be economic. The price would collapse. The whole price structure would collapse the minute it's legalized. And that's a good thing because that's what makes organized crime so interested in these artificially high prices, which they get to charge because of the risks involved in growing it. The harvest is just in western Massachusetts, and it's very refined and very expensive. And what you're paying for is the risk that the grower took. So I don't anticipate that you would see. You might see less fetishism about marijuana if it were just a part of normal life. Although that may not be true because God knows there's plenty of fetishism about alcohol, which is legal. So I don't know. That's just a guess.
Hi, thank you for coming. In light of the increased marketing of social drugs as a method of convenience, so as to say you don't have to work out, you can take this drug and lose weight, and the different marketing strategies that they are trying, especially with children, with Ritalin and Adderall, and having teachers refer to that and having that prescribed for children in schools, what do you see as sociologically as the future for the generations to come as far as drugs are concerned, especially with the increased influence of pharmaceuticals on the government as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a serious problem. That's a very serious problem. It's to the point where they're capable of inventing a disease just to market a drug they don't know how to sell. And a new diagnosis is a godsend for the pharmaceutical industry. And if you can't find a diagnosis, there's a good example recently. They were trying to sell some pill on TV for a condition called restless leg syndrome. Now, was that in like the Merck manuals? Did I missed it at some point? No, they made up restless leg syndrome to sell that drug because one of its effects is that it quiets, restless muscles or something. So they're perfectly capable of doing that. And what the impact on the future will be, I'm not sure. I'm upset at the number of drugs that are prescribed to underage people. I'm very upset by it. It's a failure of the whole regulatory mechanism that the FDA and the government really owes its citizens. And you're right. It's money and lobbying, money and limitless lobbying.
Good. Thank you so much. I think we've come to an end. Thank you. Thank you.